Imagine this. You're testifying in a Senate hearing and suddenly you're placed under arrest, not by the police, but by order of the senators themselves, all because of how you answered a question. Sounds like something out of a movie, right? But this isn't hypothetical. It's a real-life drama that went all the way to the Supreme Court, forcing a major showdown between government power and our individual rights. So let's just get right to the heart of it. Can they actually do that? Can the Senate order your arrest right there, on the spot, during a public hearing? It's a wild thought. But as we're about to find out, this exact scenario put the Senate's power to the ultimate test. And yep, it happened. In 2021, during that huge investigation into Pharmaly and the COVID-19 funds, the Senate was digging into how billions of pesos in public money were spent during the pandemic. And right in the middle of it all, 2 witnesses were cited for testifying falsely and evasively, and then ordered to be arrested. That single act kicked off a massive constitutional battle. Okay, so to figure out how we even got here, we have to back up a little. We need to understand where this power even comes from. It's not about being the police. It's actually tied directly to their main job, making laws for the country. It all boils down to this really important constitutional idea called inquiry in aid of legislation. The logic is pretty simple, right? Congress can't just make up laws in a vacuum. They need facts, they need information, and this power is what allows them to go out and get it. And there's a process to it. First, they spot a problem that might need a new law. Then they gather info, call in experts, and this is the key part. They compel testimony. Now, that word compel is a big deal. It means when they ask you to show up, it's not really an invitation you can just say no to. So that brings up the obvious question. What's the point of having the power to compel someone if there's no consequence for refusing? Exactly. That's where the power of contempt comes in. It's the enforcement mechanism, the teeth behind the investigation. The Supreme Court even calls it an essential and appropriate auxiliary to the legislative function. Basically, it makes the whole thing work. All right, so with that legal foundation in place, let's jump right back into that hearing room. The year is 2021. The committee is the Senate Blue Ribbon, and believe me, the stakes could not have been higher. So what was going on? Well, the whole investigation started because an audit report raised some serious red flags. The committee was laser-focused on this company, Pharmaly, which, get this, had only 625,000 pesos in capital, but somehow landed over 8 billion pesos in government contracts. You can see why they had questions. One of the key witnesses was Lincoln Ong, who was Pharmaly's supply chain manager. When the senators started grilling him on how a tiny company could possibly afford these huge orders, his answers got, well, a little fuzzy. He kept saying he didn't have the records with him, that he'd need to check with accounting. And the senators, they were not impressed. Yeah, they weren't buying it, not for a second. Senator Franklin Drilon, believing Ong was just stalling, made a pretty shocking motion. He stood up and said Ong was clearly lying and demanded that the Senate arrest him, right then and there. And that was it. That was the moment this whole thing went from a tense inquiry to an all-out confrontation. And just like that, the motion passed. The committee officially cited both Lincoln Ong and another witness, Michael Yang, for testifying falsely and evasively. The punishment? Immediate arrest and detention. And with that order, the fight moved out of the Senate and straight into the halls of the Supreme Court. So now we turn to the final arbiter, the Supreme Court. The lawyers for Ong and Yang basically asked the court to draw a line in the sand. They wanted to know exactly how far can the Senate's power go before it steps on a citizen's constitutional rights. The court started its analysis by looking at 3 major constitutional guardrails. Number 1, any inquiry has to be for the purpose of making laws. Number 2, the Senate has to play by its own published rules. And number 3, and this was the big one in this case, it must respect the rights of people appearing before it. You can almost think of the court's decision like a report card. So on the first 2 tests, was this for legislation? Check, yes. Did the Senate follow its own rules? Check, yes. But on that third and arguably most important test, did they respect the citizens' rights? The court gave them a big fat no, a clear failure, specifically a violation of due process. The court did not mince words. It called the contempt order a precipitate act, which is a fancy way of saying it was rushed and done without careful consideration. The court ruled this was a grave abuse of discretion because it violated one of the most basic rights we have, the right to be heard before you get punished. The witnesses were never even given a chance to explain themselves.
Now, this was a really important distinction the court made. It said, look, the Senate absolutely has the power to hold witnesses in contempt for lying. That rule is totally constitutional. What the court struck down was the way they exercise that power in this one specific case. So the key takeaway here is huge. Just because you have a power doesn't mean you can use it any way you want. The process, the how, matters just as much.
So, what's the big picture here? What does this ruling really mean for the Senate, for its power to investigate? And what should we, as citizens, take away from all this? Well, first things first, let's be super clear about what this decision does not do. It does not in any way weaken the Senate's power to investigate. The court went out of its way to say that the power to compel testimony and punish for contempt is still a vital tool in the fight against corruption. That's not going anywhere. What this ruling does do, though, is reinforce one of the most fundamental principles of our democracy, that no branch of government is above the Constitution. The Senate is powerful, for sure, but it's not all-powerful. Its actions have to follow the same rules as everyone else, especially when it comes to the Bill of Rights. And really, it all comes back to this one simple, powerful line in our Constitution. It says, the rights of people in these inquiries shall be respected. That's it. The Supreme Court's decision was basically an enforcement of that command, a critical reminder that even when you're going after corruption, due process is absolutely non-negotiable. At the end of the day, this whole case is a perfect example of the balancing act that's at the very heart of democracy. We need our government to have strong powers to investigate wrongdoing, but we also have to protect individual liberty. The Supreme Court didn't take away the Senate's power. It just demanded that they use that power fairly. And that leaves us with a really important question to think about. In the ongoing fight against corruption, how do we make sure that the pursuit of truth never ever comes at the cost of justice?